Hey everyone, it's Chrono from the Headphone Show. Today with me I have the Utopia, which is a culmination of Focal's 40 years of loudspeaker making experience, and it's designed to be a reference class headphone that delivers nothing short of the purest, most faithful listening experience. Let's check it out. The Utopia, which retails at a whopping $3,990, was actually the first headphone designed by Focal, and it's the one that introduced their signature M-shaped dome speaker driver, which has also laid the foundation for all the driver designs and variations in Focal's subsequent headphone releases. But before we discuss how the Utopia's pure beryllium driver performs, let's first talk about its packaging and accessories. The version reviewed here is the 2020 premium accessories version of the Utopia, which retails for $4,400, and its packaging has recently been updated as it now resembles that of the Stelia, with a slide-off top cover that's wrapped in pleather, albeit in black to more closely match the Utopia's aesthetic design. After sliding off the top cover, you're greeted with the Utopia in a black and gray Focal hardshell case, as well as a pleather-wrapped fold-out box which contains a 3-meter 4-pin balanced XLR cable and a wallet with the Utopia's documentation. Worth mentioning is that the Utopia also includes a 1.2-meter 3.5mm cable with a thread-on 1/4-inch adapter. I feel like I say this every time I review a Focal product, but unfortunately, until they give me a reason to stop saying it, I will note that the included cables, despite looking nice, are really bad. They're extremely stiff, and I find them awkward even for desktop use, so purchasing an aftermarket cable is highly encouraged. Moving on to build and comfort, as is to be expected from a Focal headphone, the Utopia's build is simply fantastic. The design is a blend of outstanding material work and craftsmanship, with the result being a headphone that feels and looks the part. Unless you take into account the cables, there is no component of this headphone's build that I can flaw. It's remarkably well put together, and it looks gorgeous with its sporty but elegant look. For comfort, the Utopia isn't the greatest I've tried, but I'd still say that it's a pretty easy wear. Its 490 gram weight is definitely a little on the heavier side, but I find that the headband, the pads, and clamp force help in evenly distributing the weight, making it an unlikely source of fatigue. That being said though, the inner area of the pads makes for a snug fit, and I do occasionally feel my ears touching the inner sides of the pads, which could be discomforting for some users. Still, I had no issues wearing the Utopia for several hour-long listening sessions. Alright, so now let's talk about sound. The Utopia, which was the first headphone released by Focal, immediately rose to prominence thanks to its noteworthy performance. Since its introduction, the sonic experience it delivers has been met with great acclaim, with many listeners going as far as calling it the world's best headphone. So, upon my first listen, the Utopia stunned me with its clear, deep, and musical presentation. Its enjoyable tonality is one that I think leans towards being neutral-warm, with a linear bass response, present mids, and well-tempered, airy highs. It was also distinctly fast and energetic in its presentation, with outstanding low-end control and snappy transients. There were, however, some frequency response related quirks that stood out to me, which affected the headphone's timbre, and I will be discussing those briefly. For its bass response, the Utopia is nimble, and it has an exceptional ability for texturing low tones. Then, for extension, it has an almost perfectly linear response all the way down to 20 Hz with little to no roll-off that I could hear, which lends its bass region a great sense of depth, and it allows it to surface the rumble of the lowest sub-bass frequencies. The one comment I would make about the Utopia's bass is that for my taste and preferences, it's a little lean under 115 Hz, and I think that it could benefit from either an EQ bass upshelf or from an analog bass boost if you're using an amp that has one available. Nonetheless, the bass here is excellent. It's remarkably tight, it's deep, and it's honestly the most detailed bass I've heard on a dynamic driver headphone. Moving along to the mids, the mid-range on the Utopia is where the headphone can get a little interesting. In the lower mid-range, from 300 to 1000 Hz, it has an even response that adequately reproduces fundamental tones and gives instruments a rich body. Then at around 1500 Hz though, the Utopia has a fairly significant bump of roughly 4 dB. Now, I've heard a similar peak in that region on almost all of the Focal headphones I've tried, but it felt particularly more pronounced on the Utopia, and it made its mid-range come through as a little bit stuffy sounding for me. Listening to vocal tracks, they had the tendency to sound slightly nasally, and when I listened to, for example, instrumental classical guitar pieces, I found that they could sound a bit boxier than I expected. Mind you, this was extremely subtle, but for listeners who are sensitive to tonal and timbral changes, this is definitely worth noting. One last thing I noticed was that 3K was ever so slightly forward. It didn't make the upper mid-range sound harsh, but it did occasionally come through as a little bit shouty. In the treble region, the Utopia is pretty smooth, and its balance leans a little towards the warmer side. Nonetheless, it's got ample energy between 8 to 10K, which nuances instrument and vocal overtones whilst also adding a satisfying bite to the strikes of percussive instruments. Additionally, the Utopia has some nice extension into the upper treble region, lending it some nice air qualities above 10K. The only deviation I heard here really was a small peak at 6K, which introduced some minor glare and the slightest bit of low treble sibilance. Overall though, the treble region here was very nicely tonally defined, it was never fatiguing, and it had well presented overtones or harmonics. Moving from tonality onto technical performance, let's first talk about resolution, and detail retrieval and overall sense of clarity is undoubtedly where the Utopia shines brightest. In all registers of the frequency response, the Utopia is transparent, stable, and truly exceptional when it comes to texturing instrument and vocal tones. The musical image that the Utopia paints is a pristine and realistic one that allows you to simply get lost in the music. In this regard, the Utopia is the best performer I've listened to thus far, and it eclipses the performance of my HZ800S and Verite Closed by a surprising margin. Then for soundstage imaging and layering, the Utopia's presentation is an intimate one, but it does have great depth and directional accuracy. Its soundstage is definitely one that I'd say feels very forward, not unlike that of the Focal Clear or the Sennheiser HC600 series headphones. The Utopia's imaging, though, is immaculate, and it perfectly traces the location from which sound originates, a quality which enhances the headphone's ability to replicate the recording environment. Then there's the Utopia's layering, which rivals some of the best I've heard from planar magnetic headphones like the Aria. It's adept at separating different instrument and vocal lines, which makes it incredibly easy to look into the music and focus on any one track, and it does all of it whilst remaining cohesive and highly musical. If there's one quality at which all Focal headphones excel at, it's dynamics, and of course the Utopia is no exception. In the lows, the Utopia hits with great authority, and it delivers a very satisfying sense of punch and slam. In the upper registers, the Utopia's microdynamics recreate the tactility and impact that really brings out the energy behind various instruments. For example, the tension behind guitar strings has an adequate weight and snap to it. Pianos have a nice attack that expresses the pressure with which keys are played, and percussive instruments have a well-defined strike. The result of this highly excursive quality is that the Utopia makes for one of the most engaging and lively listening experiences, which also helps in more realistically delineating the way in which music is performed. Very briefly before heading into the conclusion of this video, I just wanted to talk about EQ. Now, the Utopia has an outstanding tonal balance right out of the box, which I think most listeners will find highly enjoyable, though I still like to tweak it just to bring it a little closer to my personal preference. As I mentioned earlier, I like adding a bass upshelf under 100 Hz just to round out the lower region a little bit, and I also like to make some slight changes to the upper mid-range to make the timbre sound, for me, a bit more natural. So if you'd like to try out my EQ preset for the Utopia or any other headphone that I've reviewed, there will be a link in the description down below to a post I made on the Headphones community forums, which is basically just a list of all my EQ presets. Okay, so now to wrap up this review, the Focal Utopia very rapidly rose to the top echelon of the headphone world, and after having the opportunity to listen to it myself, it's very easy to understand why it's held in such high esteem. I think it's not particularly egregious to say that the Utopia achieves the most excellent technical performance of any dynamic driver headphone. It's incredibly fast, tuneful, and its ability to texture and nuance musical passages is somehow on a different level from anything else I've experienced. Its price tag of nearly $4,000 is hard to swallow, but if what you're looking for is the very best of what dynamic driver headphones have to offer, then look no further than the Utopia. Anyways, that is all for me today. I hope you enjoyed this video or found it useful. If you did, do consider dropping a like. If you'd like to learn more about the Utopia or other headphones, I highly encourage you to check out the review section available on headphones.com and join the discussion on the Headphones community forums. For more headphone and audio content, stay tuned by subscribing to the Headphone Show, and until next time, this is Chrono signing off.